So what are we advocating, our project at ORG? Basically, that everybody is recorded, and every person who is making records should release their information. So basically, this is largely or greatly a call on governments and parties to the conflict to make records and to release what they have. We believe that a duty exists already to record all civilian casualties in international law, and our legal team have been doing comprehensive research into this. There's a copy of their briefing here if you're interested in that research. Thirdly, we believe it is possible to do this. It's often assumed that it's not. It's too hard to get this information, especially in current conflict situations. But in fact, this is being done. Mostly we know by NGOs, some of whom are in our network, and are recording casualties of conflict from Afghanistan to Somalia, and like I said before, with various resources and coverage. But they are doing it. You could also say that the media is really a major or main recorder of casualties, or at least a source, because conflict deaths are newsworthy. They get into our newswires, they get into our newspapers, and also because the media has a presumption of transparency and verification, or at least some parts of the media. If you're interested in talking about the value of the media as a source in casualty recording, I'm sure we can talk about this at the Q&A. But basically, this is being done. We think it's possible, but this call is still necessary because this needs to be done consistently and across all conflicts. And right now, the state of knowledge of casualties worldwide is very poor, especially for civilians. Western combatants, as I mentioned, get recorded, but combatants elsewhere and civilians, the situation is bad. We don't have that information. It's lost. So I'll take the example of Afghanistan to illustrate this divide. So for our combatants, as we've seen before, they're reported in the news. We see their pictures, and they're all recorded on this website, casualties.org. You can see there's a sample from it there. Very detailed information about the people who have died, the circumstances of their deaths. For civilians, it's rather different. There are various diverging sources, such as information collected by Human Rights Watch, the United Nations mission in Afghanistan, local NGOs, and figures from ISAF, the International Security and Assistance Force, which is there. And these figures disagree. Why might this be? Perhaps because they have different coverage, different definitions, say, of who is a civilian and who is a combatant. They use different sources, and in some sources there could be political biases. But this shouldn't be a problem if all information is released to the level that I've been talking about, to the individual and the incident in which they've died. And the biggest problem to overcome the disagreement in sources is non-release at the right level. There's no transparent data, even though this information is being recorded. So there's a need for this integration, there's a need for a full picture. Of course, we know as well that some information is being collected but not released at all. As we saw from the Afghanistan war logs released by WikiLeaks last year, the US military was recording information down to the level of names about civilian casualties, and not just incidents where the US caused civilian casualties, but others as well. Here's an example of a war log and the kind of information it was giving. Unfortunately, this is for Iraq. I was trying to go on the WikiLeaks website, but I guess it was under attack or something. But it's pretty much the same for Afghanistan. Why was this information not released? Like, why is this secret? Why did it have to be a leak to get this kind of stuff out? Operational relevance has been argued, though you would think that this would kind of expire after a certain amount of time. Protection of sources, of course, as you can see, you can redact things. It's obviously clearly in the public interest for this kind of information to be released, as I've said. Perhaps the military was worried about bad public relations. We can all come up with our own reasons, though, I suppose. But it seemed overall that they just didn't want it known that they were doing this kind of recording. They stated publicly that they don't do Vietnam-style body counts now. So we don't count how many of the enemy that we've killed. We don't, of course, count civilians either. And it's often an argument used against recording that it isn't possible because it takes too much time, it takes too much effort. Our militaries are fighting a war, so why should they waste their time doing this? But that's not true, because they're obviously doing it. So the point in the context of Afghanistan I'm making mainly is that there's a lot of information out there, but it needs to be released and combined in order to do good. And earlier this year, that happened to some extent. So in 2008, ISAF set up a civilian casualties tracking cell to record civilian casualties, partly in order to award compensation, but also not only to record casualties caused by ISAF. And in January 2011, through a lot of negotiation, the ISAF CivCas database was released to the journalist John Bohannon at Science magazine, which he also combined with data from UNAMA and Afghanistan Rights Monitor, who are a local NGO, after they heard about this release by ISAF. There were important revelations from the integration of all this data. For instance, I was talking about the importance of accountability in interventions. This data showed that ISAF's lethality, in fact, had decreased. Despite an increase in civilian casualties overall, they were causing less. That's a very important thing to know. So perhaps the argument over the need to release data is beginning to be won, though actually, given that the CivCas and UNAMA information still wasn't released to the level of incident and individual, means that perhaps there is a long way to go. However, we believe that this idea is gaining some support. So, for example, in military circles, OIG has written an article with a colonel in the British Army, who's now Brigadier General, in the British Army Review, entitled "In Everyone's Interest, Recording All the Dead, Not Just Our Own." It was written with military collaboration for British military consumption. The British Army Review is the journal of the Army, it's not available to anyone else. Though in fact, we have published it on our website, and if you're interested in reading this article, I've also got some copies of that too. So the article argues that it's in the military's interest to record casualties of conflict. So, for example, to back up claims that they have reduced civilian casualties, the benefits should outweigh the costs in having this transparency. And this idea has been pretty well accepted. So, for example, at the War United Services Institute roundtable on reducing civilian casualties in Afghanistan with senior UK military officers, there was no dissension from this principle. Everybody believed this was a good idea and it could be done. The only quibble was on cost, but that was that this would cost in the hundreds of thousands of pounds as opposed to less as was estimated in the article. So basically this is realistic, and it's accepted that it is realistic to do this. And this article in fact was used in the negotiations for Science magazine to get the information in Afghanistan. So it's obviously an argument that ISAF finds quite powerful as well. We've had positive signs from governments that civilian recording of all casualties is important. So, for example, the Oslo Commitment on Armed Violence was signed up to by 62 states. This was at a Geneva conference on armed violence and the Millennium Development Goals last year. And these commitments include a commitment to the transparent monitoring of violence, so the casualties of conflict. Interestingly, I heard at the weekend on Saturday morning on the Today programme, the head of Syrian state TV and a government spokesperson using exactly our arguments, unfortunately perhaps. So the interviewer was saying to her, what about these 500 civilians who have died? And she said, oh, what lovely figures you have. Perhaps you could back them up for me. We need names, we need dates of birth. There have been 83 people who have died in Syria, and we would like a list. So she's right, but yeah, perhaps she's using this for obfuscation. But perhaps it's encouraging that this argument is being widely used, I don't know. So this kind of data is needed as well, which is significant. So there was a use of data of Iraq body count again by US Congress evaluating the cost of the Iraq war. This was the Congressional Research Service made a paper presented to US Congress on civilian casualties in Iraq. They used the data of IBC because there was nothing else around, and casualty recording records seemed the most robust to use. So this data is needed. And lastly, there is growing support in the NGO community for this work and for this idea. So, for example, the initiative on Libya of 15 organisations, which I talked about at the start, there is our practitioner network of around 24 organisations doing this work. And recently there's the example of the Together Afghanistan Campaign Coalition Initiative, which includes organisations such as Oxfam and Save the Children, and is advocating full transparency on civilian casualties. So perhaps in the not too distant future, the call to governments intervening in Libya would not be one that we would have to make. And the idea of recording all the casualties of war, both civilian and combatant, will become as accepted as the fact of recording all our military dead, which also, once upon a time, seemed outlandish to many. So if you'd like to find out more about our project, that's our website. Everycasualty.org is also the platform of the network that we administer, and it's also sort of a one-stop shop for information about civilian casualty recording, civilian casualties, all casualties of conflict worldwide. So thank you very much for having me, and I'll try now my best to answer any questions that you might have.